Thank you, Superintendent Carvalho, and thank you, Steve. As we just heard from the superintendent, schools play a huge role in the community, in our democracy, and in people's lives, well beyond what happens in the classroom. We all know that, and that is the focus of our next conversation. And for that, please welcome Christopher Norwood. He's the founder and executive director of the Florida Association of Independent Public Schools. Welcome. Sydel Highfield, a parent of 2 at North Miami Senior High School. Welcome. Frank Zenere is a school psychologist who chairs the Crisis Management Committee for Miami-Dade Public Schools. And Precious Symonette is a creative writing teacher at Miami Norland Senior High School and the founder of the Florida Freedom Writers. Welcome. And last but not least, my colleague, Atlantic editor Gillian White, is here to lead the conversation. Gillian.
Thanks, Margaret. So I feel like the place to start is obviously with Parkland. Sydel, I want to start with you. When something like this happens, basically in your backyard, what are the thoughts and emotions that are running through your mind in the aftermath?
Well, as a parent of 2, it brings me anxiety every morning to send my children to school because I want to make sure that I'll see them after school. There's no guarantee with so much of what's going on currently. My niece, who is just a year old, if she was of high school age, that's the school she's supposed to go to. And that would have been a really bitter reality for all of us in our family. So that anxiety sets in every morning when my children take the bus to go to school.
Yeah.
So it's a fearful fact.
Yeah. Chris, I'm wondering, for you, what was that experience like? What kind of thoughts did it bring up?
For myself, I don't have any children, but I volunteer with the school district in various capacities. And I had a friend of mine whose niece goes to school in that area and reached out to me, and I was shocked that something like this could happen. And then the after effects, it seemed like we failed on multiple levels that day as a community. I think our federal government failed us. I think our state government failed us. And I think our local police failed us. And I think the community organizations surrounding this tragedy failed us as well. The gun laws that we have in our state and our country are deplorable. We have one of 2 countries that constitutionally have a right to bear arms, and it's prehistoric. And personally, it motivated me to think more about what does it take to do a constitutional amendment in the United States of America. It's been so long and we've forgotten. And maybe we need to think about that, because I think that's what needs to be done.
Yeah. Frank, you have been volunteering at Parkland in the aftermath. I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about what that experience has been like. What kinds of things are you seeing, hearing?
Well, as part of a national crisis response team, I've responded to a number of shootings over the years and was called upon to come up to Parkland and work at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which I did for 13 days. About this time last week, I stood before the faculty thinking of how I could offer them words of inspiration, prepare them for coming back and with the students the following day. And I started it by saying 5 years ago, I stood before teachers and parents and community members in Connecticut following the Sandy Hook shooting. And although the city has changed, the name of the school has changed, and certainly the names of the deceased children and staff have changed, the theme is oh too familiar, that we've repeated another historical event in which a very broken child grew to become a very broken young man and made a horrific decision that affected millions of lives around this country at one level or the other.
Yeah. Precious, you work with kids every day. I'm wondering, what are the things that you're hearing from them in the aftermath of this?
So first and foremost, my heart, thoughts, prayers go out to the victims in Parkland. And it's sad because
all too often adults talk about we should do this, we should do that, but I think we're missing one important piece. We are not speaking to kids enough. We are not willing to have those courageous conversations with kids. And as a teacher, if you are not giving students the opportunity to make their voices known, you are going to hear them one way or the other. And unfortunately, an event like this takes place. I feel like a lot of my students, their hearts go out to them. Several of my students, they've gone through the educational system residing in communities that is like heavy with gangs and guns. And many of them, there was a lot of silence. They wanted to speak to some of the victims, but they understood that they just needed to fall back just a little bit, and then they were going to make their way around to speak to the students. One thing that I absolutely love is the fact that the conversations are happening between the kids now. My only regret is that it's reactive and not proactive. Imagine how different the situation could have been if these conversations would have happened before.
Right. You touched on something that I want to follow up on. You know, a school shooting like this, as tragic and horrific as it is kind of an outlier of an experience. A lot of kids, you know, in this community are dealing with violence on a daily basis, whether it be gun violence in their communities, domestic violence. They're dealing with a lot of trauma aside from things like this. I'm wondering if you all can talk to me about how you think schools in Miami are doing at dealing with kind of that day-to-day trauma. And Frank, I want to start with you.
Well, I think beyond the reactive stage, as you mentioned, we really need to focus in on the prevention pieces and think about social emotional wellness, which has a direct connection to mental health.
Right.
We often avoid the topic, and we all know of the stigma nationally toward mental health issues and concerns. But there are things we can teach children from early stages of life in terms of coping skill development, problem solving, relationship building, in general, getting along with others and being your brother's keeper. Just some really basic types of things that if we can establish social connections between students and adults that are positive and healthy, they are connected and are far, far much less likely to commit any type of violent act, and the research supports that. So there are programs out there. We certainly are examining more each and every year to bring in. Initiatives like the Sandy Hook Promise, for example, that it came out of tragedy. Start with Hello, which is a program that teaches social connection, that if you see a student sitting alone in the cafeteria, you approach them, you sit with them, or invite them back to your table. Just one example of how we can reach out and break through that isolation. And that certainly is a key for those that somehow get lost in the numbers.
Chris, I'm wondering how you're thinking about that and the implementation of some broader, more robust kind of wellness metrics for kids.
Well, Frank works in a department of a school district called the Student Services Department. And the beautiful thing about Miami-Dade Public Schools is, although it's very robust and a big bureaucracy, there are many opportunities for volunteers to interact with the school system. And one of those is Student Services Advisory Committee, in which I chair. And so there are many different organizations in our community that are engaged with our school system to help develop the policy that Frank is speaking of and help support that. And so in Miami-Dade, we have numerous mental health institutions, child health institutions that communicate with the Division of Student Services on a monthly basis and around best practices, making sure our district is responsive to what is actually happening, that organizations are seeing on a day-to-day basis.
So we've talked about a little, we'll be talking about it more throughout the night, about whether or not kids feel safe when they go to school. Do you guys think that arming teachers, librarians, coaches, having more armed guards on the premises, does that make kids safer? Does it make them feel safer? Rush, you're shaking your head.
No, it's absurd. If you're going to arm me with anything, arm me with more resources and materials to teach my students. Arm me with a little bit more of time to teach my students, to actually teach them instead of teaching to a test. Arm me with more opportunities where I can literally sit down and have a mindfulness class with my students. Arm me with things like that, but that's definitely going to tackle the social and emotional competence of kids. Academics is extremely important. We all know this, but emotional, mental, and social competence is just as important. And I think a lot of students are not feeling safe at school for one reason or the other. But once again, we're missing a very, very important piece. We are not allowing our kids to voice how they feel openly and honestly. As adults, we want to be in front of our kids and talk as if we know everything, but let's just be honest. We are not always the experts. Kids are the experts in the streets because they're there. They're there when things happen before, during, and after. But most kids are not going to come talk to us because there's this issue of trust. Why am I going to go run and tell a teacher about something that's happening when I'm going to feel as if I'm going to be demonized? I'm going to be thrown to the winds. We have to be able to build relationships with our students. All of us, all adults, we just need to be able to do that. This is not to say that kids are going to get off for the mistakes that they make. They should be held accountable, but we have to take our part in that too. Are we making our kids feel comfortable enough to speak about those things that are uncomfortable?
Frank, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think a lot of resources go into physical safety, but we need to think about psychological safety as well. And I learned a long time ago after Columbine and speaking to their superintendent that she said when we reopen schools next month, and this is 19 years ago, we could surround the school with the National Guard and all the police departments in our community, and our students, staff, and parents would feel physically safe. But psychologically, that's going to take months, if not years, to reestablish. And I think in order to make our teachers more effective, around this country, we need to increase the numbers of school mental health practitioners, counselors, school psychologists, and school social workers. The ratios of students to these professionals in this country is absurd. And unfortunately, there's a lot of great people, fortunately, yes, working to make that difference and to support teaching and education. But we need more of them.
Right. Sydel, what do you want to make your kids safer at school?
As a parent, I am completely against the teachers having to carry a concealed weapon. What happens the day that the teacher's having a bad day and he pulls out the weapon on the wrong child just because the child, I don't know, pushed his buttons? Then it's going to be a case of, okay, another teacher took out a child. So there are certain things that they can give these teachers other than a weapon. I'm sure there's teachers that are, willing to carry. They probably have a concealed weapons permit, but I don't think that's the answer. Like Frank said, arming them with mental health, maybe a facility in the school itself, more of the professional side, psychologists, psychiatrists, people to come in, speak with them that have mastered in these areas would definitely help.
I want to switch gears a little. So before we heard from the superintendent, he talked a lot about the changes that have been implemented in recent years in the school system. He talked a lot about how things have gotten better. I'm wondering what things have not gotten better. What are things that are still massive challenges that are facing students, teachers, administrators in Miami? Chris, I will start with you.
Wow. Things that, obviously the funding. The personal allocation is something that I think our school district has tried to buttress over the past 10 years. We have a allocation of funding that cannot possibly do all of the things that Frank is talking about. So I think funding would be the number one thing. I think obviously teachers need to be paid more in order to do the work that we're asking them to do. Okay. And so what we're left with most of the time is trying to do the best that we can with the little that we can. And Miami-Dade has been very successful in doing that. So I would probably say the funding is the most important thing. I would say the second most important thing is allowing parents the right to choose the type of education that they want for their children. I think that's another very important aspect of education in this century, is that parents have an opportunity to have a robust options of different ways in which to educate their children. And in Miami-Dade, we've done that tremendously, more so than in any other district in this state. So I would say those two things would be the things that we need to do better at in the future.
And Chris, I'm interested, school choice has gotten beaten back a little bit, not just in Miami, but around the country. It's become a little bit of a contentious issue. So I'm wondering how you respond to critics of school choice.
Yeah, I would respond. I think we need to make a distinction. I represent an organization that tries to represent the interests of nonprofit charter schools that are governed, managed, and operated by nonprofit institutions. And the overwhelming majority of charter schools actually are those type of organizations. Unfortunately, those that are not are receive a lot of press and a lot of the target. But the reality is that's not the majority of charter schools. The majority of charter schools are schools that are started by a teacher, started by parents, started by a community, started by a nonprofit organization that simply wants to provide a new option for the children in that neighborhood. They're not interested in being conglomerates. They're not interested in being national organizations, and they're not really interested in the real estate of those entities neither. But unfortunately, those that are the ones that people think of. And so we know in Florida that over half of the charter schools in Florida are not those entities. In Miami-Dade, though, we live in a community in which is dominated by for-profit management companies. And they've done a lot to advocate their cause in Tallahassee, and many times to the detriment of other interests, including school districts. And so we try to carve out a different way. We have schools like Aspida in Miami-Dade, that they're a community-based organization. They've been serving the elderly, the early care programs for years. And when the opportunity to actually educate children became an option for them, they became a charter school as well. And so that's the majority of the industry, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that choice is very, very important. And also, it's not to say that charter schools are better than anything. It's another option for parents to choose. And what happens a lot of times, no one will ever argue that parental involvement is not the most important thing in the success of a child's life overall. When a parent chooses where their child goes to school, that is nothing but parental involvement. And that parent is now engaged in a way in which perhaps they may not have been engaged by not having the opportunity to choose where their child goes to school.
I want to take this opportunity to let the audience know that in about 5 minutes, we're going to come to you for questions. So if you could do two things for me. One, condense your question down, and two, make sure that it's a question and not a comment. I would be greatly appreciative. So I want to talk about segregation in schools. This is something, as somebody who reports on this, I see quite a bit. When I was looking at some of the Miami numbers, it was pretty staggering. Schools that are 90% Hispanic, schools that are 90% Black. I'm wondering to what extent you guys see that as a problem and what you think is to be done about that. Pressure, we'll start with you.
So I think that experiential learning is necessary. Students come to school to learn different skills that can help them throughout their lives, but we also need to give them the opportunity to experience the world. If we are forced to stay in classes and not give kids the opportunity to experiment outside of the class, I think that kind of sort of prevents students from knowing other types of cultures that may exist. Of course, in the classroom, you could have them learning about it, but I think having students experience those things is so much different. Giving kids the opportunity to have those experiences, I think, is very important. Many of my students that I teach at Miami-Norland Senior High School have not been outside of the state. And that's really baffling to me, because I know that if they had the opportunity, they would be able to do that. And then, vice versa. Some of us, some of the teachers, we have the opportunity to kind of sort of Skype throughout the world and have the different people come into the classroom, and then vice versa. But not every student has that opportunity. And imagine how much different public education could be if students had more of those experiences.
Yeah, Frank?
Yeah, I believe strongly that our schools need to have as many experiential types of exposures to all sorts of cultures. And I think it starts with the changing of school culture
Right.
to one that is inclusive, connective, and also, as was just stated, will really give students an opportunity to be exposed to a variety of different individuals and cultures throughout not only our community, but throughout the nation. And the innovative types of programming and activities that high schools and other schools have, where students travel to do things that they perhaps never even dreamed of, to continue promoting that exposure and to do it in a very calculated way, so all have these types of experiences regardless of socioeconomic ability.
Sydel, how are you thinking about demographic makeup of schools?
I believe that I agree as well, that all children should have the exposure to different cultures, different ways of living. I think when you're just put into this box and you just have to deal with just your, I guess, demographics, and I think it doesn't give the child that kind of exposure, that kind of way of thinking. It doesn't give them. They cannot expand,
Right.
whether it's socially, whether it's mentally. They don't know how to act, how to react, how to be proactive.
It's about helping kids to be more aware of not only what they're feeling, like being mindful, but also learning to be culturally responsive to other cultures that may exist throughout the world.
Okay.
And how does one become culturally responsible or responsive? You have practice with that. More exposure allows for that to happen.
Chris, how do you think about this? And
I
also, do you think there's a way to make schools more diverse in the near term?
Well, I may have a different view on this particular one. It's 2018, and when let's be honest. We're doing a town hall on education,
Yep.
right? I can loosen up a little bit now.
Let's do that.
I think I presented myself in a very positive way. Public education started in this country as an outgrowth of what to do with slaves.
Right.
That's how public education began. This is about equity. It's not about whether someone wants to go to school with someone. People live where they live. We want equity in all schools. So people should have equitable opportunity to do many different things. There are many ways in which we can interact in our communities. This is not 1955. There are issues in our community, but I think if you were to ask a teacher in the inner city of Overtown what they want the same thing that they have over the other part of town. And so it's more about, I don't think that segregation is the biggest issue as relates to that being the parameter that gets you to equity. No, we want equity. When Thurgood Marshall argued his case, he said that kids want to go to these other schools because they've been mindsetted. They're picking dolls because they've been taught that something is better because it's over there, right? We already know now it's 2018. It's not better. We have television. We have the internet. We can see over there. What we want is equity. And I think that's what the focus should be. It's not about.
I guess my question then is, given the history of this country and how resources have traditionally been allocated,
Right.
do you think equity is possible with the level of segregation we see both residentially and in schools?
I would say that equity is possible when you have people who want it. When the superintendent talked about public education and democracy being hand in hand, we have democracy because people want it. We have democracy because people vote for it. I think when we say that we want equity and we want equality, I think equity is more important than equality. I think we live in a society in which this ideal of wanting to be equal to someone is an old ideal. To me, it's an old ideal. People want equity. I pay for something when I pay my taxes to the school system. I pay for something, right? And if I live in a certain part of town, when I pay for that, I get one thing, but if I live in another part of town and I pay for something, I get another. That's wrong. That's wrong for taxpayers. That's not American. So it's really, to me, about equity. And remember, it's not free public education. We pay for this. You know, you're getting something. It's a product that we're buying.
Right. I think we have a question right here.
Yes, I am Ingrid Robledo. I am the AP Spanish teacher at G.W. Carver Middle School. I love what you do with your students, and I appreciate that. You are my precious, precious. I wanted to, you know, it is a little bit difficult for me to understand that somebody could come over here and talk about charter schools when we all know that public education is the bridge to prosperity for this community. And there is no way that nobody could convince us that the deviation of the funds from public education to charter schools is an option. It shouldn't be. You know what is the problem? When a teacher sees one student, we see their dreams, their aspirations, and their potential. Charter schools, what they see is a sign of dollars, how they can make money with that student. And that is totally wrong. We need to continue. And it bothers me a lot when it's called traditional schools. We are the
want to give Chris a
authentic
chance
schools.
to respond.
Yes, I would
Thank
like
you.
to hear what he has to say.
Chris, do you have a quick response to that?
Oh, it's very simple. Charter schools are public schools. They always have been. They are in the state of Florida. They hire certified public teachers. The dollar, if that child that goes to a neighborhood school decides to go to another neighborhood school, that dollar follows the child. And so if the child goes from a neighborhood school to a charter school, the dollar follows the child. It's education public finance. There is no distinction. The only distinction, to be quite honest, is that charter schools actually get less money than a neighborhood school for that same child. And so, you know, I have no angst with the lady's comments because it's to be expected, but I think the schools that I represent, we have to do a better job in communicating that all charter schools are not for profit. In fact, the majority are not for profit institutions. Yeah.
I know we could have this conversation probably all night, but I do want the audience to join me in thanking our panel.
No problem.